بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today's lesson number 58 overall in our series on the book Taqreeb Tadmuriyyah, and on the section on Al-Qadr and Al-Shara' it is lesson number 23. Just to recap the previous lesson, so in the previous lesson we looked at the 4 different groups which exist among the Muslims in terms of how they where they stand in relation to Al-Qadr and Al-Shara', the decree and the legislation. So as we said, in each of these 2 principles, the divine decree and the divine legislation, there are 2 principles which are implemented before and after. So as it relates to the shara', the legislation, then a believer, he strives in seeking knowledge and understanding and in acting upon the sharia, in doing what is commanded, keeping away from what is prohibited. And so this is before the actual action, the occurrence of the legislated action. Then once he has performed the legislated action, then after that is al-istighfar, which is seeking forgiveness, which means acknowledging one's shortcomings and asking Allah for pardon for the limitations and shortcomings. And this is by necessity, because no believer and no person can be grateful to Allah with the gratitude that is due to him, because his favors are innumerable. So istighfar, following righteous deed, is a necessity, and this is the way of the prophets and messengers. It's the way of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We see that he would make istighfar 70 or 100 times every day, and so we looked at that previously. So this is the sharia. And then in relation to Al-Qadr, then before the decreed thing happens, then a believer, he puts tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he takes the ways and the means, and he uses all of his means and resources, and he makes isti'ana with Allah, which means to seek his aid, to seek his protection, to seek refuge in him from any evils that might happen or occur through Allah's decree, which harms him in his life, in his world, in his welfare, in his well-being, in his livelihood. So this is before the thing decreed. Then when the thing decreed happens, which in this context it could be a calamity, a hardship, a difficulty, it could be poverty, it could be loss of life, could be whatever it might be, then in relation to that he shows as-sabr. Right, so this is the principle after the decree. It is as-sabr, having patience and having fortitude and being resilient. And so these are 4 principles, and among the believers, among the Muslim nation, or those who ascribe to the Muslim nation and beyond as well, then the people vary in terms of how they implement these 4 principles. So in the previous lesson we looked at 4 different groups. We have the people of Iman, the people of Taqwa, who apply all 4 principles, and so these are the people who are following the prophets and the messengers. And then we have those who apply only the principles of the Sharia, but they ignore Al-Qadr. So these are the types of people that basically they'll have a lot of ibadah, a lot of worship, a lot of dhikr, very strict in that respect, But when it comes to a worldly hardship or difficulty or calamity, then they're not able to have any sabr, right? They're very weak and they fall into prohibited things. The third group is the other way around, and they are those people who they have a lot of resilience, a lot of patience, and they do have tawakkul in Allah in that sense, in that they know that their success is by Allah and that hardships and calamities come from Allah. However, they are neglectful in the actual actions of worship and in abiding by the Sharia. And so, obviously, these people, even if they are in a better position in the world compared to the second group, in the hereafter, they are in a worse position than the second group who are in a better position because of their worship and so on and so forth. So that's group number 3. And group number 4 are those who don't have either of the two principles in relation to the legislation or qadar. So then neither do they worship Allah, nor are they able to have patience upon the hardships and difficulties of life. And these people themselves, they are arrogant in worshipping their Lord. They don't worship Allah, they are arrogant. And often these types of people, you find that they seek refuge, or they are worshippers of the devil, so they find refuge with the devils, when it comes to the worldly issues, the worldly difficulties. So this would include many of the people of disbelief. And likewise, even you may find that from some of the Muslims who have fallen into some extremely deviated innovations, like many of the extreme Sufis, for example. So these were the 4 groups that we looked at in the previous lesson. Now we're really coming to the end of the book. This is the final chapter, and in this chapter, what the Shaykh has done, rahimahullah, is mention to us certain groups or certain individuals who have gone astray on these issues, right? So what are the issues that we've covered in this book? We've covered, first of all, the issue of Allah's attributes, the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How do we believe in His attributes, the various principles in relation to His attributes? This is one field of knowledge. The second field of knowledge is in relation to al-qadar, which is the divine decree, and belief in the divine decree in the correct way. And then the third field is in relation to the Sharia, to the legislation, but connected to that is, or in another way, to put it another way, it's the issue of irja. Now what is irja? Irja is to expel actions from iman, right? So we want to connect this to the Sharia, right? So let's start again. So we said in the first part of the book we covered the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, belief in Allah's attributes, right? We believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is described with beautiful names, lofty attributes. This is how we come to know Him, this is how we come to love Him, this is how we come to have love and fear and hope and other things in the heart, which then drive us to worship Him, to be grateful to Him, right? So the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our knowledge about Allah, and people deviated in this field, right? So that's one area of knowledge which is very, very important. It is from Tawheed, and if we don't have that right, we can fall into mistakes. So some people fell into those mistakes. The second thing that we covered, the major area of knowledge that we covered, is al-qadr, the divine decree. And this is a number of things. It is Allah's prior knowledge of all events. It is Allah writing that down, decreeing it to happen, willing it to happen. And the fact that al-qadr itself, the decree, is tied to some of Allah's names, like Allah's knowledge, Him having knowledge, Him being al-alim, Allah's irada, Allah's wish, Allah's desire, Allah's power, al-qudra, Allah's creative power, Allah being able to create, who is Al-Khaliq, right? So all of these names. So Al-Qadr is part of that as well. But Al-Qadr is a topic in itself. And once again, people deviated in Al-Qadr. So some people said, we are forced to do our actions, we have no choice. Other people said, well, no, we are our own independent creators of our own actions. And Allah has no role in terms of His will or in terms of His power in our actions. Right? So we are outside the domain of Allah's will and power. This is also deviation. Right? So this is Al-Qadr. Al-Qadr, the second. And the third topic that we've been discussing in the second half of the book is really the Sharia. The Sharia. But we can represent this in another way and connect it to the issue of actions. Are they from Iman or not from Iman? So this is the topic of Iman and Irja. Right? Iman and Irja. Irja is a belief which appeared in which people claimed that actions are not from faith. Actions are not from faith. And Iman is only something in the heart. Right? So Iman is belief only. And that when you have the right belief, you believe in Allah, you believe in the angels, you believe in the books, in the prophets, in the last day, in Al-Qadr, so you believe in those things in which we believe in from the unseen, that in itself is sufficient to make you a perfect believer. So you become a perfect believer by virtue of the belief itself. And actions, they are not from faith. And your faith, your Iman does not increase or decrease because actions are not from faith. Right? So this has a connection to the Sharia, to the legislation, because if actions are not from Iman, and Iman is belief only, then that means when it comes to fulfilling the obligations and keeping away from the prohibitions, then there's nothing really there in that case, because it doesn't affect your Iman, right? Because, avoiding sins and doing righteousness is not really going to increase your Iman, because your Iman is already perfect. So therefore, this is a tremendous deviation as well, right? In relation to the Sharia, which is the commands and the prohibitions. It is Al-Amr wal-Nahi, right? So I want you to see that connection between the Sharia, Shara', as we've been discussing, and the issue of Al-Irja and Iman Al-Irja, which is expelling actions from Iman. The reason why this is important to know is because some of the groups and some of the individuals that we're going to discuss in this final chapter, we are going to look at them in terms of where do they stand and how did they deviate on each of these three issues. Right? So this is the context for today's lesson, and so we start from this point here. The Shaykh says, في المفاضلة والمقارنة بين أرباب البدع. So what this title, what it means is that we are going to compare and evaluate between the chiefs and heads of innovation, the major innovations to arise in the Ummah. So the Shaykh begins by saying, he mentions numerous groups. So the first group that he speaks of, he says, نظار المتكلمين الذين يدعون التحقيق وينتسبون إلى السنة يرون التوحيد عبارة عن تحقيق توحيد الربوبية. Right, so this now is the first group. You can put down group number one in no particular, there's no particular order. So group number one, the first group are the from the people of Kalam, the people of speculative theology. And these are people who claim at-tahqiq, meaning that they claim to verify and actualize the truth, and they ascribe to the Sunnah. And their position is that they consider Tawheed to simply be an expression of believing in Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. Right? So this first group would be like the Ash'aris, for example, the Ash'a'ira. You've heard of this group, the Ash'aris. The Ash'aris, right? This would be an example of people who enter into this first category. And so what's the thing that characterizes them? To them, Tawheed is what? Tawheed is to simply believe Allah is the Lord, Allah is the Creator, Allah is the Provider. It is to believe that Allah is the Lord. And as you should know from what we've discussed previously, this is not the Tawheed of the messengers. The messengers, this wasn't the essence of the Tawheed that they called to. Right? Because this, believing in Allah as the Rabb and believing in that He alone is the Rabb, this has never been disputed by anybody. You know, in past civilizations, in past nations. If it was extremely rare. And even people like Fir'aun and Nimrud, it wasn't really a real rejection, it was more out of arrogance, even though inwardly they knew. So this group here, the mistake here is that they fall short in capturing the essence of the Tawheed of the messengers, which is Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, Tawheed al-Ibadah. It is the Tawheed of Allah's worship and Allah's right to be worshipped alone. And so this is one group. So amongst the Muslims and amongst the people of Kalam, the people of speculative theology, are those who made a mistake in the foundation of Tawheed as it relates to ibadah, as it relates to worship, right? They made a mistake because they fell short in thinking or in believing that Tawheed is simply to believe Allah is the Creator and the Lord and the Maker. So this is the first group, and an example of that, as we said, would be the Ash'aris. So what is their mistake here? The mistake is a mistake in understanding what is the Tawheed that the Quran came with, what is the Tawheed that the messengers called to. They wrongly believed that it is simply just to believe there is only one Creator, one Maker, one Provider, one Lord. And this then obviously makes them prone to fall into affairs of shirk, because they've made a mistake in the foundations of Tawheed itself. Now the second group that the Shaykh mentions, he says, or second faction of groups, is groups. وَالطَّوَائِفُ مِنْ أَهْلِ التَّصَوُّفِ الَّذِينَ يَنْتَسِبُونَ إِلَى التَّحْقِيقِ وَالْمَعْرِفَةِ غاية التوحيد عندهم شهود توحيد الربوبية. ومعلوم أن هذا هو ما أقر به المشركون، وأن الرجل لا يكون به مسلما فضلا عن أن يكون وليا من أولياء الله أو من سادات أولياء الله تعالى. So in the second group, he's now speaking about various factions of the Sufis, right? The Sufis, Ahlul Tasawwuf. And once again, they claim that they are people of tahqiq. They claim that they have reached the truth and made verification. And what is Tawheed to them? It is similar to the first group. To them, Tawheed is just to witness and observe that there is just a Creator and, a Lord. And once again, this isn't something that was rejected by the pagans to whom the messenger was sent. The messenger of Allah, when he was sent to the pagans of Mecca, and in the Quran he was ordered to ask them, say, who is the one who created you? Who is the one who created the heavens and the earth? Who is the one who regulates your affairs and gives you the faculties of hearing and seeing and sends down, the rain or the provision? All these types of questions were posed to the pagans of Mecca, and they said each time, it is Allah. It is Allah. It is Allah. They will surely say Allah. So they never denied this aspect of Tawheed, that Allah is the Lord, Maker, Provider. And this means that a person does not become a Muslim just by affirming this belief. That does not make you a Muslim. By saying, I believe Allah is one, I believe Allah is the Maker, the Provider, the Sustainer, and only He is the Creator, only He can create, only He can provide. That has not entered you into Islam at this point. What enters you into Islam is that you say, I believe only Allah has the right to be worshipped. Only Allah should be worshipped. Only Allah should be called upon. Only Allah should be bowed to, prostrated to. Only Allah should be loved with the love of worship and feared with the fear of worship, and so on and so forth. Right? So they wrongly believed that it is possible for a Muslim to become a wali of Allah, like a pious friend of Allah, just by believing in this aspect of Tawheed. That's impossible. You cannot be, how can you be a wali of Allah when your Tawheed does not go beyond the Tawheed of the polytheists, the pagans of Mecca, which is just believing there is one Maker, one Creator, one Provider? How can you be a wali of Allah just by that acknowledgement? Right? This is a mistake. It's a tremendous mistake. And you are a wali of Allah by singling out Allah in worship, by worshipping Him alone, by making dua to Him alone, by bowing to Him alone, prostrating to Him alone, and doing what is commanded, keeping away from what is prohibited. Right? So this again is another tremendous mistake, and something that you see with various factions of the Sufis. And among the Sufis there are different grades and different variations, but in general you find this understanding with the Sufis. And also, historically speaking, there's also an overlap, because historically speaking many groups or many different doctrines, they overlapped and they merged. So for example, among the Ash'aris, you will see, for example, Sufism and negation of the attributes, and in fact other things as well, as we'll see. Right? Anyhow, this is the second group among the Sufis. And another group, وطائفة أخرى تقرر هذا التوحيد مع نفي الصفات فيقعون في التقصير والتعطيل وهذا شر من حال كثير من المشركين. Right, now the third group is another group who affirms this Tawheed, meaning the Tawheed of Rububiyyah, right? Allah's Lordship. But at the same time, they negate His attributes. They negate His attributes. And so therefore, by negating His attributes, they fall into some deficiency and some negation, and doing this in fact makes them to be more evil than the state that many of the polytheists were upon. Right? In other words, we see that from the polytheists the pagans are those who actually affirmed the names and attributes of Allah. Right? And even in the Quran, the pagans of Mecca, they believed and accepted that Allah is Al-Aziz, Allah is Al-Alim, Allah is, He's the owner of the mighty throne. Right? So they believed in the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In that respect, those pagans are better than some of those people who negated the attributes of Allah. Right? Like the Jahmiyyah, as we shall discuss. So this is the third group in general, right? What is it with them? They believe in Allah's Rububiyyah, but then they made it deficient by negating the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And when it comes to Allah's names, we know that many of His names relate to His rububiyyah. Many of His names relate to His, His uluhiyyah. Right? So His names that relate to His rububiyyah, He is Al-Khaliq, He is Al-Mudabbir, He is Ar-Razzaq, the provider. He is, many other names. So if you are now going to negate those names, Al-Qadir, Al-Muqtadir, and Ar-Razzaq, and so on and so forth, and you negate these as names for Allah, then that means you are negating or diminishing aspects of His rububiyyah. So by negating His attributes, you are diminishing from His rububiyyah, which means that you are making the tawheed that you affirm to be deficient, even more deficient than what it already is. So regarding these people, the Shaykh gives an example of Al-Jahm bin Safwan. Al-Jahm bin Safwan. So this now is an individual in the early 2nd century of Islam, Al-Jahm bin Safwan, and he is called the Imam of the Jahmiyyah. Right? You've heard this group, the Jahmiyyah, the Jahmites, Jahmiyyah. And now this person, this individual, he brought many innovations, but three major innovations is, first of all, he negated the attributes. So he says Allah cannot be described with the names, most names, none of the attributes. That's one of his innovations. The second innovation is that he exaggerated in Al-Qadr. He exaggerated in Al-Qadr, which means that he claims that man is forced to do his actions. Man has no free will. Man has no choice. And it is Allah who is really doing the actions through us, through our bodies. And we don't really have any choice. Right? So this is called Al-Jabr. Al-Jabr. Al-Jabr meaning force, compulsion, to be forced. And this is something that the pagans, the polytheists, this is an argument which they used in the Quran. When they were rebuked for committing shirk, they said, لو شاء الله ما أشركنا ولا آباؤنا ولا حرمنا من شيء. Right? They said, well, if Allah had so willed, we would not have committed shirk, nor would have our forefathers, nor would we have made things haram that we weren't supposed to. Right? So they are using Al-Qadr as an argument to say that, well, we are forced to do so. And if Allah didn't want us to do this, then He wouldn't have made us do it. Right? So this doctrine or this belief, which is exaggerating in Al-Qadr and saying that we have no will, we have no free choice, and we have no power to act. It is all Allah who is willing and acting through us, and so therefore we are forced and compelled. This is the second of the major deviations that Al-Jahm bin Safwan brought into the Ummah. And however, so this is the second thing. However, when it comes to commands and prohibitions, Al-Amr wal-Nahi, then Jahm bin Safwan affirms it. So he affirms the Sharia, which means he's different from the mushrikeen, different from the polytheists. However, at the same time, he also speaks with Al-Irja. Al-Irja. Al-Irja now is the third major deviation. What is Al-Irja? Al-Irja is literally to basically expel actions from being from Iman. Right? So actions are not from Iman. Iman is something, faith is only belief. It is what is in the heart only. Right? So what makes you a perfect, complete believer? by you saying, I believe in Allah as my Lord. I believe in the existence of angels. I believe in the books. I believe in the messengers. I have all of this belief. I believe in the unseen. I believe in Allah. Right? So this is what is Iman, just that bit there. And if you believe that belief, you have now become a perfect believer. A mu'min kamil. You become a perfect believer. And there's no difference between you and your Iman and between Abu Bakr and his Iman. Why? Because what is Iman? It's simply an acknowledgement, a belief in the heart in relation to these things, in these pillars of Iman. So you believe it, so does Abu Bakr. What's the difference between you and Abu Bakr? Well, nothing, it's just a belief. Right? And actions of the heart and of the limbs are not from Iman. So, in a way, this is like a contradiction, that if Al-Jahm bin Safwan and his likes, they believe in the Sharia, they believe that there is command and prohibition, Al-Amr wal-Nahi, but then at the same time you believe Iman is only something in the heart, then that means that really there's no need to avoid sin and do the obligations or the recommendations, because your Iman is already complete. Then what's the point in acting upon the Sharia then? The command and the prohibition. So in a way, it is like a contradiction to the Sharia, and in an indirect kind of, invalidation of the Sharia, so to speak, right? Even though they believe in it and they affirm it. So this is al-irja, and what is al-irja do? As the Shaykh says, فَيَضْعُفُ الْأَمْرُ وَالنَّهِي وَالْإِقَابِ عنده وَالْإِقَابِ. Right? So basically, if you believe in al-irja, that actions are not from Iman, then you are weakening the command and the prohibition. Right? There's no encouragement for a person to avoid sin and do the obligations, because there's no command or prohibition, or it's weakened. And likewise the punishment, because even punishment for a sin doesn't apply, because if you are a believer perfect in your Iman by way of belief alone, then no matter what sin you commit, you remain a perfect believer, perfect in your Iman. And so therefore you do not deserve to be punished. So now the issue of punishment is weakened as well, because you are a believer perfect in your faith just by virtue of your belief. So you don't pray, you don't fast, you don't keep away from the major prohibited, like the haram, unlawful things, right? There's none of that found with you, yet you are a believer perfect in your Iman. So why should you be punished then? Why should you be punished then? Through no fault of your own, if your Iman is perfect. So we see the consequence of these evil doctrines, the negation of the attributes, the exaggeration in al-qadr, which we call al-jabr, and then al-irja, which is expelling actions from Iman. Right? They undermine the very religion of Islam, the religion of Islam. So this then is the third group, of which Jahm bin Safwan is an example. Another Shaykh goes on to mention some other names which are not really that common, or we're not really familiar with these names, even though they are mentioned historically speaking. He says, وَالنَّجَّارِيَّةِ أَتْبَاعُ الْحُسَيْنِ bin Muhammad al-Najjar, وَالدِّرَارِيَّةِ أتباع دِرَار bin Amr وحفص الفرد. He says, يقربون من جهم في مسائل القدر والإيمان مع مقاربتهم له أيضا في نفي الصفات. Okay, so these are just some of the names. They are very similar to Al-Jahm bin Safwan that we mentioned, right? They fall into similar things of negating the attributes and deviation in Al-Qadr, deviation in Al-Iman. So I'll give you those names again. An-Najjariyah. An-Najjariyah as a group, the followers of Al-Husayn bin Muhammad al-Najjar, one group. Another group, Ad-Dirariyah. Ad-Dirariyah, They are the followers of Dirar bin Amr. Dirar bin Amr. And a third name, Hafsan al-Farad. This was a man around the time of Imam Shafi'i, prior to before the time, the era, or in the era of Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmed. So basically, these people, they say something similar to Al-Jahm bin Safwan. So we'll call it the fourth group. The fifth group are the Al-Kullabiyah. Al-Kullabiyah. Al-Kullabiyah, they are the followers of Abdullah bin Sa'id bin Kullab. Abdullah bin Sa'id bin Kullab. والأشعرية المنتسبون لأبي الحسن الأشعري, and likewise the Ash'aris who ascribe to Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. Okay, so these groups now, the Kullabiyah and the Ash'ariyah, they are much better than the previous groups. Right? The previous groups that we mentioned have severe major deviations, but they are better than Al-Jahm bin Safwan and the Najjariya and the Dirariya and people like that, because they in the subject of the attributes, they do affirm many of the attributes. They are not complete negators of the attributes, right? So they affirm many of the attributes. And many of their leading scholars, the early scholars, they also believed in the Sifat Khabariyah. The Sifat Khabariyah. These are attributes which we only know by way of reports, by way of the akhbar, by way of being informed by Allah and His Messenger, such as, for example, Allah's face, Allah's hands, and attributes of that nature, attributes which are like that. We would never know this by reason, right? By reason, we could determine that Allah has knowledge, Allah has power, Allah has mercy, Allah has wisdom, Allah has will, right? We can determine that through reason. But we could never determine and know whether Allah, some of these other attributes, we only know that by being informed by revelation. So Allah ascended above the throne. Allah ascended above His throne. We would never know that through reason, right? So even some of the leading scholars, the early scholars among the Ash'aris and those with Ibn Kullab, they would affirm these types of attributes as well. And for example, Shaykh says, وَأَصْحَابُ Ibn Kullab كالحارث المحاسبي. That's one example, Al-Harith Al-Muhasibi. This is another name. He was around the same time as Ibn Kullab. So these ones are better than the Ash'aris, right? So Ibn Kullab and Al-Harith Al-Muhasibi, they are better than the Ash'aris, even though the Ash'aris are generally the same as them. Okay, so now this is the fifth group in general, right? So the fifth group in general is that they have better positions than the ones who've preceded. The sixth general group is called the Karramiyah. Karramiyah. These are a group of Hanafis. They are Hanafis, and they are the followers of Muhammad bin Karram. Muhammad bin Karram. And they have similar statements in general. They have some, weird positions on the attributes, some strange positions on the attributes. They have positions which oppose the Sunnah, but one of their strange views, which is notable, is that they said in the topic of al-Iman, on the topic of faith, Iman, is that Iman is something that is on the tongue only, right? It is on the tongue only. And what this means is that when a person says, for example, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh, he says the kalima la ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, and he says it with his mouth, with his tongue, it's the mere expression of the tongue that constitutes belief. Right? What does this mean? This means that even the hypocrite can be a believer. Right? Do you understand? Like if you treat Iman, faith, to be something that's an expression of the tongue only, irrespective of whether the heart really believes or not, then this means that outright hypocrites can actually be believers, can be believers. And so a believer, so a hypocrite can be a believer in the life of this world, in terms of the label that we apply to him, right? And so in terms of the hukm, the ruling upon his status, right? That he is a believer. And this is false, because a hypocrite is a disbeliever. And how can we ascribe Iman to him? By virtue of Iman just being through speech alone. What is correct is that Iman is belief in the heart, it is speech of the tongue, and it is the actions of the limbs all combined. All of that is Iman together, right? And that's what makes a believer, who believes in his heart, expresses with his tongue, and then acts with the heart and the limbs. This is what is a believer. So this is one of the strange statements of the Karramiyah, where in the topic of Iman, they said that Iman is something on the tongue only. Right? And this is their strange statement. This is group number 6. Group number 7 are the Mu'tazila, Al-Mu'tazila, and they are the followers, Atba'u Wasil bin Ata, and this is the name of a man, Wasil bin Ata. He used to sit in the gatherings of one of the famous scholars from the Tabi'een, Al-Hasan Al-Basri, rahimahullah. And so these people, the Mu'tazila, they adopted the view of the Jahmiyyah in the attributes. The Jahmiyyah, remember we mentioned them earlier on, the kind of third general group. They negated the attributes. So they followed them in that. They negated the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And likewise, in Al-Qadr, they went in the other direction, the opposite direction of the Jahmiyyah. What did they say? They say in Al-Qadr, a man is the creator of his own actions outside the domain of Allah's will and power. Meaning that when we act and when we do deeds, when we, for example, do a righteous deed, when we do an evil deed, we are acting completely independently outside the control of Allah's will and power. So in other words, what we do is outside of Allah's will and power. We are our own creators of our own actions. Right? So in essence, they are negating Al-Qadr. They are denying Al-Qadr. Right? That Al-Qadr is what Allah wills and decrees upon the actions of the servants. They say, no, Allah does not will and decree the actions of the servants. We do them ourselves, outside of Allah's will and power. Right? So this is negation of Al-Qadr, whereas the Jahmiyyah, it is exaggeration in Al-Qadr. Right? There you have no will, you have no will and you have no power to do your actions. Here you have independent will, independent power outside of Allah's control to do your actions. Right? So this is their deviation in the issue of Al-Qadr. And what they say, إِنَّ الْعَبْدِ مُسْتَقِلٌ بِعَمَلِهِ بِكَامِلِ الْإِرَادَ فِيهِ ليس لله في عمله تقدير ولا خلق ففيهم نوع من الشرك من هذا الباب. So this is the type of shirk, right? What the Mu'tazila fall into by saying that man is the creator of his own actions. This is a type of shirk. Why? Because they are saying that there are creators of, which are outside which are creators alongside Allah. We are creating our actions outside the domain of Allah's will and power. So therefore, we are creators as well, so to speak. This now is ascribing partners to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is opposite to Jahm. What did Jahm say? That he said, إِنَّ الْعَبْدِ مُجْبَرٌ عَلَى عَمَلِهِ وَلَيْسَ لَهُ إِرَادَةٌ فِيهِ. Right? The servant is compelled and forced upon his actions. He has no will or wish therein. Right? So this is another deviation of the Mu'tazila in relation to Al-Qadr. Right? So they deviated in the attributes and they deviated in Al-Qadr, opposite to the Jahmiyyah. And then also they have another view in the issue of Al-Asma' wal-Ahkam. Right? Al-Asma' wal-Ahkam. What does this mean? It means the issue of labels and judgments upon people, upon Muslims. This is called Al-Asma' wal-Ahkam. Right? For example, in the life of this world, a hypocrite is labeled a Muslim. Right? Because that's what we see. That's what we see. This is al-ism. This is the label which is applied to an individual. He's a Muslim. But the actual hukm, the actual true and real ruling upon that individual in the knowledge of Allah is that he is a hypocrite. Right? So this label, al-asma wal-ahkam, is to do with how do we apply labels and rulings upon people. Right? It relates to, like I just said, who is a believer, who is not a believer, who is a kafir, when can we call a Muslim a kafir, whatever. This is to do with labels and judgments. And in this field, the Mu'tazila, they made a mistake because they considered a person who falls into a major sin to be not a Muslim, right? He's left Iman, but they don't say he's entered into kufr, right? So they took a position where they said that the one who commits a major sin, he is in a position between the two positions. He said, manzila bayna al-manzilatayn. Al-manzila bayna al-manzilatayn. Right? This is like one of the views of the Mu'tazila, where they said, a person who commits a major sin, let's say he drinks, for example, they say right now he's totally left Iman. He's left Iman. He's left Iman. So we're not going to say he's a believer. But then they also say, well, even though he's left Iman, he's not entered into kufr. That's in the life of this world, right? So we're not going to say believer, nor are we going to say disbeliever. But we're going to say he's in a position between the two positions. Now this is wrong. This is wrong. This is a mistake in the field of al-asma wal-ahkam, right? In the issue of applying labels and applying rulings to people. What is correct is a person who drinks, for example, alcohol, he is a believer, he has Iman with him, but he is a sinful, deficient believer. So we can call him a believer, but we can't call him a perfect believer, because clearly his Iman is not perfect, right? To the Jahmiyyah, the one who drinks alcohol would be a perfect believer. Why? Because to the Jahmiyyah, Iman is only what's in the heart. So he can drink alcohol, he can steal, he can fornicate, he can do whatever. He will always remain a perfect believer. This is a mistake in al-asma wal-ahkam, in applying labels and rulings, right? The label upon such a person is that he is a sinful believer. a sinful believer under the threat of punishment for his sin. Right? So this is a mistake that the Mu'tazila fell into. To them, they say that a sinful Muslim is neither a believer nor a disbeliever. He's in a neutral, he's like in an in-between state in the life of this world. And the Jahmiyyah, what do they say? They say no, the sinful believer is actually, he's a believer perfect in his Iman. So once again, we see that these two groups are in like slightly different opposing positions. The Jahmiyyah are saying, a believer who drinks, gambles, steals, cheats, he is complete and perfect in his Iman. And the Mu'tazila say that the one who cheats, steals, whatever, then he's left Iman, but he's not entered into kufr. And then there's another group, which is the Khawarij, and we know that they say the one who drinks, fornicates, gambles, he's completely left Iman and he's entered into kufr. Right? So see these different views, right, which are deviations in the field of al-Iman, which relates to the Sharia, and in the field of al-Asma wal-Ahkam. Right? So these things were never found in the time of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. These major deviations, they came afterwards, the more serious deviations. The deviations which were present in the time of the Sahaba was the deviation in Al-Qadr and the deviation of the Khawarij. Right? But these deviations in relation to Iman of the Jahmiyyah and the negation of the attributes, they came after the Sahaba, and they are more serious deviations. And as Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he says, and as Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah mentions as well, وَإِنَّمَا يَظْهَرُ مِنَ الْبِدَعِ أَوَّلًا مَا كَانَ أَخَفَّ وَكُلَّمَا ضَعُفَ مَنْ يَقُومُ بِنُورِ النُّبُوَّةِ قَوِيَّتِ الْبِدَعِ وَكُلَّمَا كَانَ رَجُلٌ إِلَى السَّلَفِ وَالْأَئِمَّةِ أَقْرَبَ كَانَ قَوْلُهُ أَعْلَى وَأَفْضَلُ. Right? This is like a general observation that innovations, when they appear, first of all, they are light. Right? They are light innovations. And every time people are weak, or people who stand by the prophetic way and the prophetic guidance, then the innovations get stronger, meaning they get severe. And every time a man is closer to the way of the Salaf, then his speech is going to be loftier and better and superior. Right? And this is true because if you look at the order in which the innovations appeared, what's the first innovation? The innovation of the Khawarij. Right? What's their innovation? They saw injustice, as they claimed, and they saw actions from the Sahaba that they claimed were unjust and that they didn't like, and so they revolted and they rebelled and they broke away. Right? So this here doesn't have anything to do with the religion necessarily. It's opposition to perceived injustice and then splitting away. Right? That's the Khawarij. And then you have the Rafida, kind of similar. They, broke away. They were unhappy with certain, like the civil strife, and they broke away. So it's similar. But then the next innovation is to do with Al-Qadr. Al-Qadr. Right? This is not directly to do with Allah Himself, His names and attributes, but it's to do with the decree of Allah and the inability to understand the decree of Allah and punishment and reward, for righteousness and sin, for sin and righteousness, right? So they were unable to understand that, and so they fell into a deviation in relation to Al-Qadr. And then you have the deviation in Al-Iman, Iman in Allah. So now we're coming a bit closer now, right? This is to do with what is faith, what is Iman. Is it belief only? Is it speech? and belief, or speech only? Is it belief, speech and action? What is faith? What's the nature and the reality of faith? Right, so that's the fourth deviation, right, which is coming closer to the actual religion itself. It pertains to the actual religion, right? Whereas Al-Qadr is not quite like that. Then the next innovation is the negation of the attributes. To negate Allah's attributes. This happened at the beginning of the 2nd century. Al-Jahm bin Safwan, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila took it from them, right? So the innovations get worse and more serious as time goes on, and the further away that we get from the time of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. And then after that, then there are other innovations that start appearing. But this is the point that the Shaykh is making. So this now leads us to, so we're speaking about the Mu'tazila, group number 7 in general. And so this leads us to another group, which is Al-Mutasawwifa, another group of the Sufis, Al-Mutasawwifa, الذين يشهدون الحقيقة الكونية مع إعراضهم عن الأمر والنهي شر من القدرية المعتزلة ونحوهم. So this is another group, and again, these are the ones that we discussed previously, where they, these are the people who kind of are like upon wahdatul wujud, and this extreme Sufis, where they don't believe in the command and the prohibition. They don't believe that we have to abide by the Sharia and do the commands and the prohibitions, and that all that exists is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? There's no separate existence of Allah the Creator and His creation. All existence is one existence, and so therefore there's no such concept of the command and the prohibition, because how can Allah command and prohibit Himself when everything is Allah, right? So these types of Sufis, and this is like, as we said, Wahdatul Wujud, they are more evil. They are more evil than the Mu'tazila, the Qadariyah, and people like them that we discussed previously, right? And these people actually resemble the mushrikun, the polytheists, the pagans. These people resemble the polytheists, whereas the Mu'tazila, who deny Al-Qadr, they resemble more the Majus, the Magians, because the Magians believed in two gods, the God of good, the God of evil, the God of light, the God of darkness. And so the Mu'tazila, when they said that man creates his own actions, right, and so therefore they are creators alongside Allah, they resemble the Magians. So the Sufis are worse, these type of Sufis, because they resemble the polytheists. And the Mu'tazila, they resemble the Majus, the Magians, the fire worshippers, because of their view on Al-Qadr. Right? So then there's another group of Sufis, we'll call that group 9. There's in fact another group of Sufis. These Sufis, they actually do respect the command and the prohibition. So they believe in acting upon the Sharia, and they believe in Al-Qadr, and they believe in Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, but they have errors in other things. These people are better than the Mu'tazila. These people are better than the Mu'tazila. Anyhow, these are like 8 or 9 groups. The important thing to understand in all of this is that the Muslim nation deviated and differed in these areas. In the area of Allah's attributes, in the area of Al-Qadr, the divine decree, and the area of the Sharia, the command and the prohibition. Or to put it another way, Al-Irja, right? Whether actions are from Iman or not. And so all of these groups that we've discussed, we've pointed out, the Shaykh has pointed out, where they stand on each of these issues, and how some of them are further away from the truth and more misguided, and others have lesser deviation and are better and more superior. And this we are able to say this because of our knowledge of what Allah revealed, because of our knowledge of the way of the Salaf, the way of the companions, the way of the Sahaba. We are able to objectively evaluate all of these groups and to point out where they went astray, in what areas they went astray, and the degree and level of their misguidance. We are able to do that as Muslims, right? Because as Muslims, we have the Quran, we have the Sunnah, we have the understanding and the way of the Salaf, of the early companions, the companions and the early Muslims, the Salaf. We are able to objectively make all of these determinations. This is something that the Jews cannot do, the Christians cannot do, because they do not have a preserved revelation, nor do they have the intact, the interpretation of the text as well, right? Because it is an altered religion. It is an abrogated, altered religion. And we are able to do this objectively because, the Quran has been preserved in its text and likewise in its interpretation. So finally, we can just quickly finish off because we have just, a closing statement and some texts. So the Shaykh says that all of these groups, وَكُلُّ هَذِهِ الطَّوَائِفِ عِنْدَهَا مِنَ الضَّلَالِ وَالْبِدَعِ بِقَدَرْ مَا فَارَقَتْ بِهِ جَمَاعَةُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ وَسُنَّتَهُم. That all of these groups have innovation and misguidance to the extent that they departed from the main body of the Muslims and, the Sunnah. And the Deen of Allah, what is the Deen of Allah? The Deen of Allah, the religion of Allah, is what He sent His messengers with and what He revealed His books with. And this is the straight path, the path of the Messenger of Allah and the path of His companions who are the best of this nation. And this nation is the best of all nations, right? So that is a straight path. And Allah Azza wa Jal has commanded us in the Quran when we say, اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم. We are commanded to say this in every prayer. We ask Allah, oh Allah, guide us to the straight path, not the path of those upon whom is your anger, nor the path of those who go astray. Those who are upon whom is Allah's anger, they are the likes of the Yahud, of the Jews, because they have knowledge and they do not act upon knowledge. They know the truth but do not act upon the truth. And those who are astray, they are like the Nasara, the Christians, because they worship Allah upon other than knowledge. So they don't know the truth and then they act in the absence of truth, in the absence of knowledge. So likewise, the Shaykh says that it used to be said, كان يقال تعوذوا بالله من فتنة العالم الفاجر والعابد الجاهل. Right? Seek refuge from the tribulation of the evil scholar, the evil sinful scholar, the scholar who falls into major sin and from the ignorant worshipper. The ignorant worshipper. So this is like the Yahud and the Nasara, because the Yahud, the Jews in general, they are characterized by the learned who do not act upon the knowledge. And the Nasara, the Christians in general, they are characterized as ignorant worshippers, right, who do not worship upon knowledge. And likewise, he mentions the hadith of Ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, that the Messenger of Allah, he drew a line in the sand, a straight line in the sand, and then he drew lines to the right and to the left like this, and then he pointed to the straight line and he said, هذا سبيل الله هذا سبيل الله مستقيما. This is the straight path of Allah. And then about the lines to the left and the right, he said, وهذه سبل هذه سبل ليس منها سبيل إلا عليه شيطان يدعو إليه. That these are paths, and at the end of each path there is a devil that calls to these paths. And then he mentioned the verse in the Quran, وَأَنَّ هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا فَاتَّبِعُوهُ وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا السُّبُلَ فَتَفَرَّقَ بِكُمْ عَنْ سَبِيلِهِ. This is the straight path. This is my straight path, so follow it. and do not follow the other paths, lest they split you or separate you from his path. Right? And then also Hudhayfa bin al-Yaman radiyallahu anhu, he said, O gathering of the reciters of the Quran, be upright and take the path of those who came before you. For by Allah, if you were to follow them, then you have been preceded with a good precedence. And if you were to go to the left or to the right, then you would have gone astray with a great strain, with a great misguidance. Right? So he's advising the people to stick to the way of the companions, those who came before, and to be upon uprightness. And Ibn Mas'ud also said, Man kana minkum mustannan falyastanna biman qad mat fa innal hayy la tu'manu alayhi al-fitna. He says, whoever amongst you wants to follow someone, then let him follow the one who has died. Because indeed the living person is not secure from tribulation. The living person is not secure from tribulation. So if you want to follow people in your religion, follow those who have died, who died upon righteousness, who died upon uprightness, who died upon the sunnah, who died upon the way of the salaf, and you know they died upon that, then guard yourself by way of them. But as for the living person who's still alive, then he is not secure from tribulation. And then he says, أولئك أصحاب محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم أبر هذه الأمة قلوبا وأعمقها علما وأقلها تكلفا. He basically says that those companions of Muhammad صلى الله عليه وسلم, they were the most righteous of this ummah in terms of their hearts. They had the most righteous hearts. And they were the most deeply and profoundly rooted in knowledge. And they were the least pretentious or overbearing. Right? They didn't go beyond the limits and, impose burdens or things like that. And they are a people, قوم اختارهم الله تعالى لصحبة نبيه. They are a people whom Allah chose to accompany His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and to establish His religion, وإقامة دينه. فاعرفوا لهم حقهم. So acknowledge the right that they have, وتمسكوا بهديهم, and hold fast by way of their guidance. فإنهم على الهدى المستقيم. For indeed they are upon clear, upright guidance. And so this brings us to the end. The Shaykh, نسأل الله تعالى أن يجعلنا منهم وأن لا يزيغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هدانا والحمد لله رب العالمين. The Shaykh finishes at the end with a dua. We ask Allah Ta'ala to make us from among them, and that He does not cause our hearts to be deviated after He guided us, and all praise is due to Allah, the Lord of the worlds. So this kind of brings us to the end of the treatise, and it brings us to the end of this series of lessons. So with that, inshallah, we can conclude our lesson there for today. And inshallah, maybe in the next lesson we'll see, either we'll maybe do a recap or something, or we might just do like a one-off lecture before Ramadan or something like that, inshallah ta'ala, just to fill up the gap between now and Ramadan, the next week or two. So with that, we'll conclude our lesson. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.